So Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, it's so great to have you here. We know that your time is in high demand, and you've already had such a busy week. I saw you on Monday giving that wonderful, having that discussion with Ta-Nehisi Coates at Riverside Church in commemoration of Dr. King. That night you jetted off and you went on the late night show with Colbert, where I hear you cursed out the entire country.
Oh, yeah, apparently.
On a scale of 0 to some, how many do you give?
I think it's 0.
And this morning I saw on Instagram stories that you had a Democratic caucus meeting and you were explaining to your followers exactly what it meant and the way that you do in what is one of the only remaining civics classes, I think, that's left in the country. And it's only Wednesday. So I just want to start by asking you, how are you feeling right now?
I'm feeling good. It's funny that you say it's Wednesday, because now I feel most days I have no idea what day it is. And people are like, have a good weekend. And I'm like, what?
So would it be fair to say that some of the cooking that happens on Instagram Live is a necessity because you just have to multitask?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It definitely is. I think it is a good way to use technology to reach constituents, because sometimes it's just physically almost impossible with demands in our time. So we have to figure out ways to kind of use the small pockets of time that we do have creatively, even if it's just when I'm, prepping vegetables for dinner. If I can get a conversation about policy in there, it's tremendously effective.
And if you make your campaign less about you and more about the issues impacting the community that you seek to serve, I think it's extremely effective and the best way to go about it. What the heck is going on with this? Hold on. I'm gonna whisk this coconut milk.
So how did the course go that you taught? You taught a kind of Twitter for Dummies class.
I wouldn't say dummies.
Twitter for members of Congress, which is kind of synonymous.
Today, Ocasio-Cortez will be leading a session on the Hill to help school her fellow Democrats on social media skills. That'll go over well.
So how'd that go?
It went really well. This one was more of a rapid fire, so this session was really a panel. And it was myself, it was Ted Lieu, who himself has a very large Twitter following, Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, as well as some of the Twitter government kind of outreach folks at Twitter itself. And actually House Ethics was there, because there are House Ethics rules based on what you can tweet, when you can tweet it. And so they kind of covered the ethics side, and I kind of covered just my approach and how we can better get, I think, a party message to really resonate with people.
Well, Twitter has come a long way on the Hill. When it first came around, I remember seeing a sign in Longworth for the cafeteria that said to follow the Longworth cafeteria, call this extension.
Whoa!
Call them up, then they'll tell you what the handle is, then you can go.
Oh my gosh!
I did not follow Longworth cafeteria. I'm curious, as you went from kind of an obscure candidate to then much less obscure candidate, but still not global celebrity, then go to Democratic nominee, then go to Democratic Congresswoman, each moment you kind of ratchet up in the amount of public attention that you're getting. Did you ever notice yourself kind of self-censoring a little bit or thinking an extra beat? And how did you deal with that? Or did you not?
Yeah,
If you didn't, it's almost kind of weird.
Yeah. No, I actually, for me, the most stressful time was right after the primary, because that, I think, was the biggest, starkest difference in my life. Literally overnight, I went from no one caring who I was unless I was swiping my Metro card too slow to everyone being like, who is she? What is this? All these cameras all over the place. And it was just a completely alien change. I was extremely stressed out because it felt like everything I said had so much more weight overnight. And I felt an insane amount of pressure to, I really do feel the weight of that responsibility. And when people stop me, or a couple of days after the primary, I was in my neighborhood and I turned around this corner to get on the street, and this woman saw me and just started crying. Like, she just broke down crying.
Wow.
And even though I didn't feel like a different person, I felt this immense responsibility of all of these people's hopes and dreams for our future. And it is something that I grapple with a lot, because I know it's not me. It's like this avatar of me. And but I still feel a responsibility to do the best that I can.
If I can make an observation about you, having watched your Twitter come up over the past a few months or 6 months or whatever it's been, it's that, it feels to me like your messaging is so consistent and so kind of unimpeachable, because it's coming from a kind of a value system that is consistent and unimpeachable, at least from my point of view. And I think that sometimes gets missed in this conversation about what makes authenticity.
Yeah.
I sometimes, I've given this some thought myself. I'm, obviously not Ocasio-Cortez, but I went from relative, like a nobody lawyer to working for The Intercept. And I remember feeling suddenly, I can't tweet about my digestive tract today in the way I might have before. And suddenly feeling like, oh, maybe this is going to have a stymieing effect, a silencing effect on what I actually say. And then having to think about, well, the reason why anybody actually cared in the first place is because there was a kind of a zeitgeist that I felt like I was tapping into. And you said this in your remarks with Ta-Nehisi Coates the other day, that you felt as much as you were, talking or tweeting, you were also listening, and that you felt like you were one of many voices, and that you just had a platform to amplify those voices more so.
Yeah. I think that's probably one thing that I did not share in this Twitter 101, because maybe that's more of a 201, in that it's not just an outlet, it's also an inlet, in that it is a place where you take temperature, where you take pulse, and it's not just how to tweet, but it's also how to listen and how to read, and that really tells you where people are at, where the zeitgeist is, so that you can kind of be speaking in a way that is not going against the tide of the language and the mood and the sentiment of where people are.
Can you think of any examples of where your kind of antenna was tuned to like a public reaction to a particular thing? Did you like notice like, oh wow, Green New Deal is like really popping now, like people are really hungry for this, or
I think
any of the reverse? Or?
Yeah, I do. It started off unintentionally, but I feel like I end up listening to things in that I'll tweet something, and something that gets particularly extra traction, I kind of dissect, especially if I didn't expect it to build traction, and I'm like, And it was a similar thing actually with the Green New Deal, is that we were floating this as a policy discussion before even the general election, and what we found was that we were interviewing policy experts and academics and activists and advocates about this, and we weren't even sure if we wanted to call it a Green New Deal. I wasn't 1,000% sure on that kind of branding, if you will, or how we would talk about that. And what we found was that it was kind of a working title. Green New Deal was a working title, and we almost had the understanding that it was going to be called something else, but it kept like leaking and catching, and people just started writing articles calling it a Green New Deal before we even said anything or called it that ourselves. And so because of that, that was a moment where I was listening, and it was like, okay, let's not try to force our own thing on this. If this is building traction, if it's easily being communicated, then let's just run with it.
One thing I noticed after the election, in that kind of fraught moment where you were kind of proving yourself to the country, you really leaned into it. Like you basically took all comers, and then and you were hitting on all of the strides. And then you did the one I forget what the exact quote was. It was some misstep about Israel.
Oh, yeah, the firing line, which then got doctored. And then the doctored video is the one that made it on Fox News.
Right.
And then, like, everyone just sees the doctored version instead of the actual exchange, which is, you know.
It did feel like you stepped back a little bit. And
Yeah.
maybe there was already a scheduled recalibration, but it did feel like after that you were like, okay,
I
we
think-
pushed it as far as we could.
Yeah.
Now it's time to.
I do think that there were a couple of things happening in that moment. One is that everyone in the world thought that my general election was a sure thing except me. I did not think that my win in the general was a sure thing.
I didn't either.
Yeah, we talked about it.
It might
Yeah,
have been two,
no.
might have been two people.
I did not. And like everyone around me was like, you're crazy. Like it's going to be a landslide. And I was like, no, it's not. And we were getting a lot of evidence on the ground that supported my feelings on that. And so I really did not want to reach over what I thought I could. And actually, before that interview even happened, I had already agreed that that was going to be my last one. And it just ended up ending on a bad note.
We wanted to bring in Brad Miller, who's was for a long time a senior member of the House Financial Services Committee. Brad, thanks for joining us. Brad Miller is a congressman, represented Raleigh in North Carolina, was on the Financial Services Committee, one of the kind of the leading progressives, became one of the leading progressives on the committee, pushing for Glass-Steagall to be reinstated, for the banks to be broken up, for bankers to be thrown in prison.
With a fair trial.
Fair trial first.
First we'd give a fair trial. then we'd
Subprime
put them in
lending
prison.
to be regulated.
What?
Subprime lending to be regulated. He was lead sponsor of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau over in the House. But before we go to Brad, I wanted to get your insight on banking issues because of your own experience with banking. Now that kind of after you won the nomination, it was your mansion in Yorktown was was uncovered.
my 2-bedroom mansion.
and that had actually been, part of our coverage of the race and had been part of your story the entire time. But it did involve foreclosure. It involved was it called the probate court or the
surrogates court?
The surrogates court. So what was your experience with the banks and with foreclosure?
Well, I feel like for me, I was largely shielded from direct interactions with the bank because at that time when my father passed, I was just around 18 years old and I was in college. So it was really my mother that was kind of struggling with this. But she would tell me stories secondhand about how she was trying to refinance our home or how the usual, like very normal things that a bank would do in other circumstances to give a consumer or a homeowner a little bit of leeway, whether it's allowing them to refinance their home or, provide a certain extension, were suddenly not happening. And this was, we were confronting the double whammy, as you already reported on, of us struggling with our payments in the middle of a financial crisis, but also losing my father, who was the main breadwinner in our home. And so I only would hear secondhand about my mom's stressors. But I remember being at the house and there would be these cars that started pulling up and taking pictures of our house. And I would ask my mom, like, what is going on? And she had no idea. She's like, I don't know. Our payments are okay. We're barely making them, but we're making them. But the bank was kind of declining refinancing, and it was clear that they were trying to just make it as hard as possible for us to keep going. And, and people were just taking pictures of the house. They were just anticipating something happening. And so and my mom would walk up to them and be like, what are you doing? And they basically say, well, we're taking photos from the street. You can't really tell us what to do. And it was just very deeply unsettling. And that's when these predatory practices that we knew banks engaged in leapt off the page, leapt off the television, and it was literally on the street in front of my house. And it's like, what is this? But,
and it's not just what banks do, it's often what they don't do, which follow the law when it comes to modifications or refinancing or just work work with people. So you're now going to be in a position to regulate those banks. You know, banks were unwilling to work with you a couple years ago. Now they're going to have to work with you. You know, what's she facing from the banks on the House Financial Services Committee?
You're facing a lot of members who will be more senior than you, who don't have those sympathies, have certainly not experienced it themselves. Most members of the committee are not going to be all that immersed in the details, and certainly in the time that I was there, towards the end, after the financial crisis hit, after we were in the foreclosure crisis, it became apparent that servicing of mortgages was a huge problem, and we just couldn't get those of us who were trying to do something about it just could not get them to do anything. And there were times that I just wanted to take somebody from Fannie or Freddie who said we can't do anything except what we're doing. We can't do it anyway except the way we're doing it, and just throw them out the window. The unspoken, unacknowledged priority was always about helping the banks kind of jiggle their finances so they could appear to be solvent and they wouldn't have to recognize losses on mortgages. I mean, it was a shameful time in our history. And I think household wealth, people's life savings, families' life savings, fell by $9 trillion in the years immediately after the financial crisis because of foreclosures, and not just foreclosures, not just people losing their home, but people seeing the value of their home collapse. And it was just not the priority of anybody in Washington. And that was never acknowledged. They always wrung their hands and said, oh yes, gosh, we are doing so much, this is so bad, we're doing everything we can. But everything they could have done that would have been effective would have made the banks recognize their losses, and and the banks would have been revealed, many of them, to be insolvent. And it was a great frustration of my life.
So I have a question.
Sure.
Because you were serving in Congress and on the committee in the years leading up to the crisis. And I know that I remember very well when the crisis was unfolding, because this was around the time that my father had passed away. And there were so many momentous things that were happening. Barack Obama was elected that November, but earlier that year was when Lehman collapsed. And so
Lehman collapse almost, that was really what precipitated the real crisis.
There were all of these things unfolding, but I remember it was really that fall when everything was starting to fall apart, and there was just this universal sense of what is going on. Like we know that the markets are crashing, we don't know why, we don't know what's going on, and then it wasn't until later that that conversations about derivatives and credit swaps and all of these things were going on. But in that moment, there was so much bewilderment. And I'm curious, for you serving in the time that you did, what was it like? Were members passing things and like we just didn't know what was getting passed? Nobody
knew. We were. I think one of the things that I think you need to think about is trying to make sure you get a variety of sources of information, because the committee was being spoon-fed by the industry. The industry said all these financial innovations are just great. They're making home ownership available. They're the derivatives are allowing people to manage risk, and
it was things more secure.
All good. It was all good. It was just the wonders of unfettered capitalism. And then when the financial and we were completely unprepared. It took years. I mean, I try to piece together what really did happen, and I don't think we've done it. I know that we had the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, but people's sense is that in Washington, the real decisions are made behind closed doors, and they aren't made in their interest. And they're not wrong about that. And I think that's why Democrats need to look at ourselves and say, how could we have lost to this guy?
Yeah. Absolutely.
You know, I mean, we can talk about how bad Trump is all we want, but we lost to that
Exactly.
guy.
Exactly.
And the American people, the Clinton campaign ran as the choice. Anybody was for her.
The word coordination's been thrown around.
Yes,
Not my word, I'm just saying.
coordination. The field was cleared for her, and they seemed never to understand that it was a change election. That the electorate was fit to be tied, was angry, and Bernie was thought to be this year's or that year's Dennis Kucinich. I say this with no disrespect to Dennis, but Dennis never got more than about 5%. And Bernie was thought to be a message candidate, I think even by Bernie. And he got 47% of pledged delegates. He won 20-some primaries, 20-some states. And the Clinton campaign and the Democratic establishment never really figured out things have come unstuck. And they talked about how the math didn't work and Bernie couldn't possibly win the nomination. And I think that Bernie's supporters already thought that Clinton and the Clinton campaign were the Borg, and that just sounded like resistance is futile. So they never quite caught on, and I'm not sure they've caught on yet.
I think one thing a lot of people might not know about the committee structure is that there's a literal price tag for joining these committees. The more powerful a committee is, and the more powerful an industry it regulates, the more money you're expected to be able to raise, and therefore you have to ante up. And this is not kind of a theoretical thing. They put a price on this stuff, and they call it dues.
Right.
And you turn this money over to the DCCC.
Yeah, I remember in kind of expressing interest in which committees I wanted. First, very early after I won my primary, there was a lot of outreach from incumbent Democrats, and the one question that everyone kept asking was, what committee do you want to be on? What committee do you want to be on? And I literally had just gotten elected, and I'm like, I don't know, what committees are there? There's and they do change in name from one administration, one majority to another, and everyone was so immediate in that one question, not how are you doing, how are you coping, hey, you came out of nowhere, it was what committee do you want to be on? And I remember thinking, wow, why is this the question? And I spent one day in DC and I met with some folks, and it wasn't until like the very end of the day that I was told, well, if you want a good committee, you got to raise funds. And I remember saying, well, and I was like, because at that time I had raised funds for other progressive candidates. I had driven folks to their donation links and things like that. And so by that time we had raised over, I think $50,000 or $100,000 for other progressive non-corporate funded campaigns. And I was like, oh, but I am raising funds. And they're like, oh, no, to the D-Trip. And I was like, oh, but I had just gone through this year where at the time the D-Trip had gone against other progressive candidates. And I was like, okay, well, I remember leading that and I'm like, well, I'm going to get put on some terrible committee. And so, election time comes and we're just getting our committee assignments this week. So it's January, of the new term. But we've basically spent the last 3 months since Election Day lobbying, and it's this very opaque process. No one gives you a sheet of paper and says, like, this is how you get on a committee. And so a lot of freshmen are just kind of babes in the woods, like, how do I do this? And you just talk to a lot of people. But one of the interesting developments on financial services is because we were asking to be put on an exclusive committee, and financial services is an exclusive committee, and for a freshman that does not normally happen. And then we started feeling like suddenly this request was being made was much more, we're feeling much more reception to this request than we had anticipated. We're like, what's going on? And I had sat down with Chairman Waters. I had spoken with a lot of other members, and it seems like we're in this very interesting moment where after the financial crisis, all these activists and advocates really started zeroing in on the Financial Services Committee, and because its members were getting so much more scrutiny than they had in the past, it no longer became the same kind of fundraising committee because those members were getting targeted a lot. And so as a result, a lot of these even incumbent members that were on it have left the committee to go to other money committees. And so it's opened up this huge window. And so this year, the Financial Services Committee has actually been staffed with a lot of progressives on it to kind of occupy that space. And in fact, frontline members it's seen as too difficult of an assignment, like on judiciary. You'll have too many tough votes. So a lot of frontline members aren't on financial services. Some still are, but it's an interesting, I think, like sea change.
Yeah, I think it's changed dramatically from when I was appointed to the committee, and I was appointed as a first-term member, and then what it became. I mean, it seems kind of odd to remember this, but when I was elected, I wanted to avoid the committees that seemed to have a lot of litmus test, party line, hot issues, because I perceive myself as a moderate. And so I've avoided judiciary because it's all just, and same thing was true of education in the workforce, or education and labor, the Republicans call it when they're in control. And financial services was thought to be kind of a backwater, but certainly not where the fault line in American politics would be. And the issue I picked, the old advice for new members of Congress is pick some obscure technical issue, but become the expert on that. And your picture will be on a milk carton. But you'll be doing important work. So the obscure technical issue I picked was subprime mortgages.
Wow. Wow.
And it shows how Congress, responds to incentives. Like the shame works, political organizing works.
Yeah,
It does.
I think you did a tweet thread about this, and you have a
did.
picture of somebody sitting with a Monopoly man, a guy dressed as the
Yeah.
Monopoly man behind them, applying that kind of psychic pressure.
But then from that, the committee became more and more dominated by first-term members and presumed to be competitive districts so they could raise money. And then all they did in Washington was make phone calls.
Yeah.
So if you were a bank lobbyist or a Wall Street lobbyist, all you had to do to have the ear of a member of the Financial Services Committee was wait for the phone to ring, and you didn't have to wait very long. And it became a really tough committee for any progressive points of view.
Brad, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
So in our last few minutes, I just got to talk 2020 with you.
Okay.
Some people hate the horse race. I unabashedly love it. We've had a lot of exciting high-profile announcements this week. Kamala Harris was in there. Obviously, Elizabeth Warren has been in the race for a while now. Kirsten Gillibrand. I mean, we have 3 of the top leaders now, all women. This has generated a lot of excitement.
Yeah.
Depending on how much credibility you put in certain DNA tests, several of those women are women of color.
Oh my gosh.
So the question becomes, what are we looking for? What are our kind of priorities in this race? I have been, noticing a lot of excitement around the idea of glass ceiling breaking candidates or candidates who will be first for reasons that are understandable. But there is
Pete Buttigieg on the cover of the Washington Post magazine, first millennial president.
first millennial
Who?
president, first gay president.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a lot of firsts.
Exactly. He's
Yeah.
the mayor of South Bend.
Oh,
Which is
sorry. I
Alexandria.
did not mean that in a disrespectful way.
No, but it's warranted.
Yeah, no, you should say what Alex said earlier.
Oh, what? He's named after a
place
town.
where the highway bends.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. So he could be great.
He could be great.
He could be great.
But the question becomes, in that profile, there was nary a mention of any policy. So the question becomes, there seems to be this division between candidates where identity is being emphasized and candidates where policy is being emphasized. And I think that what a lot of people are really attracted to about you is that you're a candidate or a representative now who is able to merge the two in a way that fulfills a lot of people's interests. So I'm curious about you. There's been a lot of talk of litmus tests. People put a lot of different things in their litmus tests. What are you looking for in an emerging 2020 candidate? What are your priorities?
So I think that oftentimes policy and progressivism gets pitted against identity in a lot of different ways, and it just like makes a mess, I think. And for me, I think it's important on one side, for the progressive side, to not ignore the power of identity, because I know when I was running my race in the very beginning, I was running with a very strong progressive base and a very strong progressive coalition, but that alone was not enough to take me over the top. And it was when I really leaned in on this broader message and crafted a progressive message that was rooted in my life story, that we were able to really capture a much wider electorate, even though my progressive message was still the same. And so I think it's important that we don't ignore the power of identity, because it is very powerful, especially for women, especially for the rage of women right now. It is, Rebecca Traister has written about this. It's like, women's rage is a very potent political force, and it changes things on the right and the left. It was primarily these women back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. It was primarily these white women who were supporting the Ku Klux Klan that got all of these statues erected in the South that are being taken down today, that people think were erected around the time of the Civil War. Right. And so it's a very potent political force on both sides of the aisle. And so I think it's something that we shouldn't ignore. I think it's great that we have multiple female presidential candidates, so there's not the woman running, and then it's like, oh my God, So I'm very excited about there being multiple women across that can represent different parts of the political spectrum on the left. So that's something that I'm thankful for, because it means that we don't get boxed in as one belief, and so I think that's really good. I am a horse race hater. I hate them. I'm like, don't ask me until the day before the New York primary. It's like how I feel. But I do think that obviously from maybe not obviously, but I think it's pretty obvious. Like, what we're trying to do is frame the debate and the conversation that we're going to be happening that we're going to be having in the next 2 years, regardless of what that candidate is. So I do not think that for the future of humanity and for our country to continue to prosper, that we cannot have another presidential cycle where climate change is not being asked about at almost every debate. And that includes the role of fossil fuel industries, and that includes the role of a broad spectrum of issues. And so I think that climate change needs to not be a nice thing for us to talk about, but it needs to be a critical thing for us to talk about. Of course, it would be amazing to see Green New Deal talked about, and it's starting to, and so that's really exciting. But I think it's less a hard litmus test on a specific issue and more a litmus test on framing. So I do not think that the 2020 candidate can afford to not have an intersectional message that weaves the story of race and class.
So one thing that was really interesting in the whole course of the remarks of the Martin Luther King Day event on Monday was that this is an event that is honoring Martin Luther King, a civil rights hero. It's predominantly, overwhelmingly African American audience and speakers and movement leaders who were there. And my impression of the event was that the politics being espoused were much more to the left of what we normally hear out of mainstream Democrats. And that is in direct contrast with the message we constantly hear about what certain communities, what the Black community really wants. And the idea that progressivism and people of color are in two different buckets and need to be catered to in these two very different ways.
Yeah, which I find funny, because the polling and all of the data and everything that we feel and see shows that the opposite is true, is that communities of color are usually much further to the left than white liberals, because racism, colonialism we understand through lived experience in a way that many don't understand, that these are issues that are part of a hyper-capitalist framework. Black folks are descendants of slaves that were imported, quote unquote, by slave owners to the United States for the explicit purpose of cultivating crops. And it was predicated on white supremacy and racial superiority, but we have to understand that white supremacy exists for a reason, and they exist for very specific cultural and economic reasons. And LBJ talked about this. Like, if you can convince a poor white man that he's superior to a black man, he'll empty his pockets for you. And so it's not just economic reasons why racism exists, but there are economic reasons why racism is perpetuated and incentivized, whether that's housing, income, etc. And like I said on Monday with Ta-Nehisi, until America tells the truth about itself, we're never going to heal. And it's like this thing that as a culture we hide, we make excuses for, we do the economic anxiety thing when Trump wins, and it's like it's like this big wound with a big ugly scab on it, and it's just gonna stay this itchy thing that we keep going back to until we just deal with it. And
so what is, I think the part that is interesting to me is there is, from my perspective, a bit of this cultural instinct to say it's easy to, certain people have appropriated the idea that we have to acknowledge and deal with a problem, which I think is right, as a kind of a be-all, end-all. And I think that one of my political concerns is that there is this kind of space in the Democratic Party that says, if I stand on a stage and I say the word intersectionality, if I stand on the stage and say, we have to address these issues and racism is real, then everybody applauds, and there's not necessarily kind of the policy follow-up that's necessary to start to address those root causes. And so I do think that that's what makes your message particularly powerful, that you're someone who's able to blend those interests together. And I'm curious to see what's going to happen in 2020 if we get people who are really good at kind of saying the thing that over the course of the last 5 years or so, people have kind of gotten that you need to say. And those who can actually connect that to, okay, I'm not going to say we need to redress past harms and then say, but I don't care that the most uninsured population in the country is Hispanic, and we're not going to deal with Medicare for all.
And Brianna and I were talking about this the other day.
Yeah,
it'd be like the cheering at just the mention of racism would be like if a politician went up and said unemployment's at 15%. And the crowd cheered.
Yeah, applause. They wait for applause.
Right, right.
No, that's not a good thing.
It's like,
economic misery is
real.
What
I imagine is like when they're like, and we need to, and like when, they say discrimination or unfair incarceration of black men, and then they pause and the crowd cheers, and it's like in their mind they're like, you're welcome.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, why
for
are you
acknowledging
cheering?
it. And it's like, okay, acknowledging racism is a really big step.
Yeah, it's a necessary first step.
It's a really big step from where we were, but you're right, it's nowhere near enough, and the solutions are so painful, frankly. I find the solutions for white communities to be very painful, because it's very painful for a community to understand and go through this. Like, the idea that you can be poor and benefit from the color of your skin does not compute for a lot of people. And going through that realization is very painful, or even just economically for people that were born with silver spoons. It's very painful to admit that you had advantages, and it's just
look what happened to Brett Kavanaugh when he was confronted.
Oh my God!
No, it
literally is an identity meltdown. It's a fundamental.
I worked for everything I ever had.
Yeah, and like that is the majority of a lot of communities, how a lot of communities feel, and it's because if you haven't had a transition in your life where, you were maybe born poor or born without, certain privileges, and then especially as you transition into having certain privileges in your life, you actually see and feel and sense and taste and smell all of the differences. If you've never experienced different treatment in your life, you wouldn't know what different treatment feels like or looks like. And it's really, really hard. I mean, it's like, and we can almost every single person in this country can acknowledge some privilege of some type.
Right.
I'm a cisgendered woman. I will never know the trauma of feeling like I'm not born in the right body. And that is a privilege that I have no matter how poor my family was when I was born. But it's really hard for some people to admit that they, it's part of this weird American dream mythology that we have that in a lot of circumstances isn't as true or isn't as clearly communicated as we'd like for it to be or we wish it was.
Yeah, I'm working on it. Maybe next piece on privileged dialogues and how to make it more constructive.
Look forward to that one.
My mentions don't.
Yeah, it's hard. I don't envy you.
Well, thank you so much for coming and spending the time with us and getting into all of these subjects. We hope to have similar conversations with you in the future.
Yeah, totally. This is great. Thank you.
Great to see you.